Will mass protests in Paris overthrow President Macron? How did a rule change for pensioners imperil the Fifth French Republic? The world is in a crisis it has not seen for 100 years. Some say we are already in World War III or a war to defend democracy. I say a new multipolar free and fair world has been born. Old assumptions about who rules the world and how they rule are changing. But we should not panic, and on the Burning Archive, I offer you calm reflections on history to help you through this crisis. Each week I focus on one big event from the multipolar world connected to real stories of history and share a fragment from the cultural heritage of the whole multipolar world. This week on the Burning Archive, we look at the political crisis in France. How did a change to the retirement age lead to Paris burning? Are these mass protests a good or a bad sign about the health of French or Western democracy? Or are they just another incarnation of revolutionary mob violence by the contentious French? They are the questions on today's Burning Archive.
What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee.
Welcome to today's Burning Archive, the podcast where the past is not dead. The past is not even past. I am Jeff Rich. I am an independent author and podcaster, a former historian, former now retired, a very, very minor government official who is curious about all the world's cultural traditions of responsible statecraft. And in this episode of the Burning Archive, I am finally looking at Western Europe. I have discussed today's Russia, America, China, India, even little old Australia on the podcast, but not Western Europe, although I have done a few historical episodes on the Crusades and similar issues. But the scenes in France over the last month or so are dramatic, and they've brought my attention to what is going on in France and to what extent can we draw conclusions from France about broader problems in Western democracies. The questions they do provoke in people's minds, with dramatic footage of rubbish bins being burned, Emmanuel Macron's favourite restaurant in Paris being burnt down, the headquarters of the investment firm BlackRock in Paris being invaded, and like 1 million people being on the street in Paris. Very dramatic events. Is this a people's revolt, or is even some kind of a revolution going on in France? How does it compare to the largely peaceful protests that occurred in America over the last few years, or other recent large protests for democracy in Iran, Georgia, Israel, and across the world? How does it even compare to the large, very large protests in which I participated in Melbourne in 2021, maybe, over the pandemic law restrictions? Is this a tricolor revolution? Each week on the podcast, I go through 3 segments. The first segment is a focus on a big event in world affairs. The second is a historical reflection, a connection of that event to some real events in history. And then thirdly, I look at a text or some fragment from the cultural heritage of the world that might shed some eccentric light on the issue. And let's look first at the issue of the pension rules and the political crisis in France.
La parole est à Madame la Première ministre.
So my in-focus issue about world affairs this week is the political crisis provoked by changes to pension rules in France. So what is the issue? In brief, Emmanuel Macron, President of France, and one should explain, of course, that France has both an elected president and an elected prime minister, and the prime minister is drawn from the French parliament, whereas the president is elected directly through separate elections. So the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, raised the minimum retirement age in France from 62 to 64, or at least he planned to. He wanted to control costs, which of course Social Security is very expensive, and make the French economy more competitive, build workforce participation. But he did not have enough support in the French National Assembly to vote these changes into law, so he used a special constitutional power to make, in effect, an emergency decree, but to make an emergency decree that effectively bypassed the French National Assembly, the French Parliament. This turned a campaign of opposition by unions and others into wild and largely peaceful but somewhat violent mass protests, with up to 1 million in the streets and fires being lit, and some of the emergency services workers joining the protesters. On the surface, such wild protest in relationship to a change in pension rules might seem a little out of proportion. The French pension age is lower than most European countries, lower than Australia's, and the cost of its pension system is quite significantly higher. We all know about ageing populations and increasing life expectancy, so reform seems reasonable, right? But the changes mostly impacted manual lower income workers, whose anger and sense of exclusion has grown over decades and has been expressed in recent years in the Gilets jaunes, yellow vests protests. To them, this was another attack by elites on their social conditions, and in addition, very widespread support for opposition to the changes to the pension within the union movement within France. But still, that perhaps doesn't quite explain the depth of the feeling about the issue. Although some commentators from England and America are falling into stereotypes about the contentious French or violent extremist protesters, far right-wing extremist protesters, or the lazy French who are dependent on welfare and pensions, I think we need to look a little bit deeper at what it's all about, because people feel this is actually an attack on democracy. And just like in the last day or so, Emmanuel Macron has returned from his trip to Beijing and gone to the Netherlands, where he was making a keynote speech about the future of Europe. But a number of protesters rained on his parade. Let's have a little listen.
Mesdames et messieurs les ministres, dear ministers, members of parliament, Monsieur le Président, dear Rob, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I have to say that I do admire Nexus Institute, what you do and how much you delivered such strong messages, not just for Europe, but for humanity and our common values. Hello.
I think we lost something. Where is French democracy? Where did we lost it? Where did we lost it?
I can answer this question if you give me some time.
So there we have the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, speaking in English in the Netherlands, being interrupted by some relatively young protesters, not presumably eligible for the pension age, saying, "I think we have lost democracy in France." And I should add that the protests, although they're largely focused on the pension age issue, there's a wide range of issues that have melded into them. There's some environmental issues as well, and those protesters go on to make a few comments about that. But it's really the decision by Emmanuel Macron to enforce these pension changes by emergency decree that has, I guess, aggravated the emotion of the protests. But why have people got so emotional about a change to the pension rules? Well, let's have a look at what is really the story here. And for that, we need to go back all the way to 1981, the year I think I began university at the University of Melbourne, 1981, and I can remember these events because in 1981 in France, the French Socialist Party, after a long time being out of power, was elected into government, and Francois Mitterrand became the president of France, together with a majority in the French National Assembly. And the Francois Mitterrand Socialist Party went about introducing a major set of economic policy changes in the belief that there was still an alternative to liberal capitalist democracy, if you like, still an alternative of socialist democracy. And among those changes, which I won't detail, but among those changes was the reduction of the pension age from 65 to 60. So this is more than just a technical policy issue about ageing population and superannuation and calculations of savings over time. It is actually quite totemic, I think, for an alternative political system for, let's call it neoliberalism, even though I don't entirely like that term, but it's a widely used term, so we'll just use that for now. But the dominant political ideology that's dominated Western democracies since the 1980s, and not just Western democracies, but also quite a few Eastern European democracies as well. Mitterrand ended up, despite his earnest attempts to, I guess, introduce socialism in one country, became an early victim of floating currencies, unstable financial markets, the dollar empire, and the Washington Consensus. Some of the issues I talked about last week in the podcast on the end of the dollar empire. It had to change course, but in its broader economic policy, but the pension age stuck. It is one of those fundamental rules, how long people work when they sort of get to retire, that governments generally don't want to mess with too much. It's like the life cycle clock. It sort of sets people's expectations of what they can reasonably want to do in their life. Subsequent French presidents tried to reverse this change because it was quite a low retirement age, and it was a minimum retirement age. So many office-based workers would have continued working for much longer, but particularly for the sort of manual industrial type workers, it was a very important working condition. And many of those workers were also, like railway workers, etc., were public sector workers in France, which made it even more complicated because governments were changing the working conditions of their own employees. Jacques Chirac tried twice, but it was not until 2007 when the new conservative Nicolas Sarkozy actually introduced significant changes to the pension age, raising them, despite quite significant protests. And then in 2012, François Hollande partly reversed those changes. Macron, when he was elected in 2017, argued for these pension reforms, but a few things have gotten in the way since then. COVID, war, protests over a fuel tax in France. But given how long the issue has bubbled away, the reforms introduced by Macron appear to have been somewhat badly conceived. Without getting into all the technical details, even Vladimir Putin in Moscow has in fact commented on this, noting that many countries had carried out such reforms, lifting the pension age, including dear old Australia, of course, but also including Russia. But there seem to be some notable design flaws in the current French proposal. Design flaws that went to issues of justice, I guess. And a French commentator, the relatively famous French historian and economist, or economic historian, Thomas Piketty, wrote in Le Monde in February that, and here I quote, "In order to face up to major challenges such as ageing, it is certainly inevitable that everyone should be asked to contribute, but it must be done fairly. There is only one way of trying to convince public opinion of the justice of a reform. It must be demonstrated that the effort required represents a higher proportion of income and wealth for the richest than for the poorest." Critically, Macron failed this test. Now, it is a difficult test, and I can speak from experience working in government, looking at issues of intergenerational fairness, I guess, or the impact of population ageing and all that sort of thing, that pension changes are extremely difficult to get right. It's extremely difficult to work out a simple and fair set of rules that will not have inequitable impacts, inequitable distributions for some people. In essence, one of the key issues is there's a tension between the value for the pensioner and the value for the government of a long period of accumulation of them saving up for retirement until 67 or 70 or till you drop, versus the understandable desire, especially amongst workers who put their body at risk, I guess, every day, physically somehow or other, whether it's working on a nursing ward or on a construction site or heavy industrial labour. The body wears out after a while. By the age of 62 or 64, one really kind of wants to start doing something else. So it's really hard to get those sort of things right. But best efforts don't really count in politics, and Macron did not, or failed to, win over broad support for his changes, even though he had been talking about them since 2017. He instead imposed technocratic reforms despite a weak mandate, and it would appear that his technocrats rather let him down. It's another case of le trahison des clercs. The French bureaucratic elite have been widely criticised in France, so much so that Macron even had to abolish the famous school, the École Normale d'Administration, where so many of the bureaucratic elite were trained, and indeed where Emmanuel Macron was trained. And this, let's call it, loss of authority of the bureaucratic elite, and this identification of Macron as part of the bureaucratic elite is very much part of the dynamics of the political protests as well. And there's two more issues that are worth mentioning there. Macron did win the presidential election last year, but he did so in a rather underwhelming way. To some degree, he was a default candidate because many people did not want to either choose Marine Le Pen, or the more left-wing candidate who was, I think, even proposing France leave NATO. And he then, a few months later, lost rather badly, including his political party, which had really been formed around his personality. He lost rather badly in the parliamentary election, so he no longer effectively had political control of the National Assembly. Macron himself emerged as a political figure after the collapse of the traditional parties, the Socialist Party and the Gaullist Party that I can't quite remember the name of, in the sort of 2010s. And so he is both a product and a symptom of a political system in crisis, I guess, or at least that has lost a lot of authority, a lot of the connection between the elites and the voters. And then, in addition, the war in Ukraine has also added to inflation and living costs, and there is growing opposition to NATO, which France has a long tradition of being at least ambivalent about, certainly the relationship with America. People like Thomas Piketty and also the demographer, anthropologist, sociologist, historian Emmanuel Todd are leading intellectuals who are very critical of the current rather pro-American neoliberal, again as a convenient label, neoliberal stance of the leading French technocrats, the leading French politicians. So, in summary, the mass protests in France were provoked by poorly designed changes to the social contract, if you like, poor leadership capacity in a post-democratic state, and a growing desire among elites and the public to try the alternative to the Washington consensus in economic policy, rules on the length of working life introduced when France still believed in European sovereignty and socialist democracy, became the lightning rod for this social discontent. Now, on the 14th of April, the French Constitutional Court will rule on the legality of Emmanuel Macron's emergency decree, and that will be quite significant, I think. The French Fifth Republic that has been in place since Charles de Gaulle and 1958, that survived the turmoil of May 68 and all sorts of other events. Well, the Financial Times has even speculated that French Fifth Republic could fall as a result of the political crisis in France. I suspect the French Fifth Republic won't fall, but we will see, and the French Constitutional Court decision, unfortunately, is occurring pretty close to when I generally release the podcast, or in fact afterwards. But I am going to provide an update to this podcast on my Substack newsletter, which you can join for free at Jeffrich, JEFFRICH.substack.com, and provide the news on what the outcome of that French Constitutional Court decision is and how it might impact on the future of Emmanuel Macron. Let's not speculate for now. But many people have been stirred by this example of people taking to the streets in Paris and sticking it to the elites. Similarly, Western media often celebrate people power, Arab Springs, colour revolutions. So my historical reflection today is on the social myths of the revolutionary crowd and the power of mass protests as the bedrock of democracy.
notre côté, la police, ce sont vos enfants qui sont là. C'est votre avenir qui est là.
So the second segment of the podcast connects a big issue in world affairs to real events in history, and my reflections on that is history, illustrating how the past is not dead. The past is not even past. We still feel its influences, its reverberation, its mythology, the stories that we tell ourselves about the past today. And big protests like the one that have been going on in Paris provoke and evoke historical myths about the revolutionary crowd. Many people find the idea of revolution exciting, and I can even remember back when I was a very, very minor government official reading an internal strategic plan in the Department of Health that was celebrating the fact that they were enacting a revolution. It sent a bit of a chill through my aging body. But the revolutionary crowd often inspires hope for people, that people can take back control of history. But then when violence is mixed in, as it is now in the protest in France, both on the side of the authorities and on the side of the protesters, those emotions and myths get quite heightened, get quite intense. Mass protests form powerful social myths. Stories about history and protests in history can both motivate and mislead people. People's response to protests can be driven by the social myths that they cling to. And we have seen many examples of this in both recent times and in history. In recent times, in the media, we have seen enormous protests in Iran, in Georgia, in Israel, and of course in Belarus, in the protests in Ukraine, and of course protests in America, in Australia, in England, and all sorts of other places as well. In history, we've had Tiananmen Square, the Velvet Revolution in Prague in 1989, the 1917 Russian revolutions, the First Indian War of Independence, or as the British know it, the Indian Mutiny, in 1857, and the Boston Tea Party, part of the actions of the revolutionary crowd, violence of a largely peaceful protest that contributed to the American Revolution. And of course, there is the French Revolution itself between 1789 and the later 1790s. People power protests are often celebrated in the Western media, but non-Western democracies or regimes often cast shade on these protests as colour revolutions. And people's response to violence in protests can often be driven by their loyalty to a cause. For example, there was very contrasting emotional reactions, understandably contrasting emotional reactions that people had to the Black Lives Matter protests and the anti-lockdown protests over 2020 to 2022. There's similarly different reactions to the freedom fighters in Iran or versus the protesters who might be associated with right-wing or working-class politics in France. And some of this difference in response led to the Iranian government posting a social media post about the police violence towards protesters in the French protests, commenting that they were extremely concerned about human rights abuses in France, making a very similar comment to what EU officials said about the protests in Iran. But of the actions of the revolutionary crowd, perhaps the most important in terms of laying down some of these social myths is the French revolutionary crowd from 1789 to 1798 or so. From the liberation of the Bastille to the Great Terror of Robespierre and Saint-Just, and never forgetting the extraordinary violence of the Vendée. It has long been a source of both social myth and historical debate, and the reaction to the violence of the crowd in that event influenced political ideologies still. The whole idea of right and left goes back to the French Revolution, but more deeply still, the response to the violence of the crowd in the French Revolution, response to the energy, the violence, the excess, the power of those mass demonstrations, has influenced political ideologies deeply. It inspired, I guess, the left-wing revolutionary tradition. It inspired the conservative tradition, Edmund Burke, and his reflections on the revolution in France. It inspired European liberalism. Benjamin Constant and the wonderful Madame Germaine de Staël are very much ways of working through what to do with what was revealed about people in the revolutionary crowd. On a side note, Madame Germaine de Staël, I must do an episode on at some point. She once said that men do not change, they unmask themselves. She is a truly extraordinary and central figure, both in the French Revolution and also the evolution of European thought. Afterwards, back to the French Revolutionary crowd, it also inspired a lot of work on mass hysteria, group political psychology. Gustave Le Bon's work was very much trying to make sense of the revolutionary crowd. Revolutionary crowd violence is a sign of the breakdown of political order and of the bonds between the elites and people. It's not to be simply denounced or simply celebrated, but I think imaginatively responded to. We'll see whether Emmanuel Macron is able to do so. But all Western democracies face this question of how to ride the dragon of the energy of the streets, or to side with the people power, unsteady and sometimes fitful and sometimes violent though it might be, or to choose, as Max Weber said, to bore through the thick boards of institutions and build institutions of civil politics. And the working the way through this choice between talk and direct action, I guess, is made more difficult by the fragmented cultures and societies that we live in. So this same question that I guess faced all those thinkers who dealt with the French revolutionary crowd is facing us today when we see the protests in France, when we see the protests in Iran and Georgia, and when we think through the choices between stability and instability in many countries, when we try to work out what to do when in our degraded democracies there are spasmodic outbreaks of violence and extremism. And in doing so, we need to pay attention to how our imagination activates these social myths of the revolutionary crowd, of people power, of the excitement or the terror of revolutions, and how that imagination can also act to constrain the violence we are sometimes prone to, and that sometimes breaks out in the realm of politics. So the third segment of the podcast is always a look back on some piece of the heritage of the multipolar world to find some illumination or inspiration from what I call the burning archive, that sense of the enormous treasure trove of culture and history that we have access to, but we can sometimes lose connection with just because, well, there is so much to read and to look at. Now, the fate of the French Revolution and its violent crowd is often contrasted to America, that had a revolution without descending into terror. But given that the American Revolution released a state that has been at war for all but 17 years since 1776, maybe that link between revolution and violence also holds for America. It is constantly seeking to export its American Revolution violently to the rest of the world in endless wars. But Hannah Arendt, the great German-American Jewish writer who wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism and Eichmann in Jerusalem and other works, she wrote a great book called On Revolution that reflects on contrasting models of revolution and its connection to violence. And I'll include a link to where you can access that wonderful reflection by Hannah Arendt in my Substack newsletter, jeffrich, jeffrich.substack.com. And in that book from, I think, the 1960s, Hannah Arendt wrote, "Revolutions and wars are not even conceivable outside the domain of violence, and this is enough to set them both apart from all other political phenomena. It would be difficult to deny that one of the reasons why wars have turned so easily into revolutions, and why revolutions have shown this ominous inclination to unleash wars, is that violence is a kind of common denominator for both." And she also reflected on how this issue of violence and the difficulty of elites exercising authority over the people who are in principle equal, but in practice rather subordinated, is a fundamental problem for democratic societies, or for modern societies. So it's a wonderful text, and one I'd sort of recommend. But I thought I'd also add in another little fragment from the Burning Archive, which is from a great book by historian Simon Sharma called Citizens, a Chronicle of the French Revolution. And Sharma's book was, I guess, a reaction to the traditional Marxist historiography that had dominated studies of the French Revolution for decades, and which tended to speak in celebratory terms of the dynamism and agency of the French revolutionary crowd, even with its violence, and also to justify, I guess, the violence of the terror as a response to war and civil war. And he sort of reanimated he wrote within the tradition, I guess, of a small c, let's call it conservative tradition, which was alarmed and responded to that violence, that was disconcerted by the violence much more, if you like, in the tradition of some of the French historians of the 19th century, and to some degree of the great Germain de Stael. And towards the end, or in fact in the epilogue of Citizen Simon Sharma asks, why was the French Revolution like this? Why did it inspire this high ideals and this horrifying violence? Why, from the beginning, was it powered by brutality? And part of his answer, the fragment of the burning archive that I will focus on here, is how, I guess, romanticisation of violence in both word and deed drove violence in political action, and, if you like, was the force that led the children of the figures of the revolution to eat their own children, as Danton famously said. And on page 861 of Citizens, Simon Sharma writes, these events were, to borrow from Burke, as in Edmund Burke, Reflections on the French Revolution, both sublime and terrible, and it was perhaps romanticism with its addiction to the absolute and the ideal, its fondness for the vertiginous and the macabre, its concept of political energy as above all electrical, its obsession with the heart, its preference for passion over reason, for virtue over peace, that supplied a crucial ingredient in the mentality of the revolutionary elite, its association of liberty with wildness, its association of liberty with wildness. What began with Lafayette's infatuation with statues of a hyena surely ended in the ceremonies of the pile-stuck heads. And so one wonders if some... and that same tension we are all still wrestling with today. And that is the wonderful virtue of consulting the burning archive, because we can consult the wisdom of the ages. So I'll have some additional links to material I've discussed on this podcast in my Substack newsletter, at which you can join for free. There's a weekly newsletter. You can get glimpses of the multipolar world at jeffrich.substack.com. That's Jeff with a J. And do also like, share, subscribe, all that sort of thing. Both this podcast, whatever platform you're listening to it, leave us a review on iTunes or on Spotify, or a positive rating on Spotify. And you can maybe give a shout out to the Burning Archive, even on Twitter if you wanted to, and recommend it to your friends or within your network. And also you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you do join up to the Substack newsletter, you'll find there you can also upgrade your subscription and support me and support my writing. And I believe I'm also going to be having an article published on John Menadew's Pearls and Irritations on American foreign policy and the threat it poses to the world. So check that out, and I'll probably talk about that a little bit more in a podcast to come shortly. So do all those things. Consult the Burning Archive. Keep an eye on what's going on in France, and do remember, what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee.
What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee.